right, so we're picking back up with our second part of my brief lecture on Francis Fukuyama's new book called Identity, The Demand for Dignity in the Politics of Resentment. And in part one of this talk, I talked a little bit about Fukuyama's account of how the political world has changed in the last 40 years. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about how those changes were brought on by certain modern conception of selfhood or ethos, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about how it relates to rhetoric. So as we've been saying, identity is kind of ethos, a sense of self, right? And Fukuyama observes that really this self can't come into being without public recognition of its authenticity, right? You could say you are whoever you want to say you are, but if the people, the audience of that statement of identity say, no, that's not who you are, right? If that's what they say, then that identity is uninhabitable for you. And Fukuyama seems aware that what this does is infringe upon the individual's perception of dignity and self-worth. So let's go a little bit deeper into this. Key in Fukuyama's conception of this dignity is Socrates' account of the soul in the Republic. And it's interesting rhetorically that Socrates in the Republic says that the aim of his discourse is to construct the just city in speech, which suggests that, it's the speech, the rhetorical activity that brings into being the ideal society that he describes in the Republic. And so that brings to mind the performative and constructive elements of rhetorical activity and interaction writ large. But Plato's Socrates says that we need to understand the soul if we're going to be able to describe this just society. And he says that the soul has two parts. This is also echoed in Plato's Phaedrus, as we've talked about in some other lectures here on YouTube. So the soul has a rational component and an irrational component. And in the Phaedrus, this takes the form of the good horse and the bad horse that drive the chariot, right? And so the rational part of you is the part of you that knows the good and that wants to do it. It's the part of you that after you've had one slice of cake and want another says, one's enough, right? It's the part of you after a couple drinks, right, who says, I think I'm done for tonight. I'll feel better tomorrow, right? And it's the part of you that doesn't engage in risky activities or doesn't belittle or demean another person just because you might feel good in doing it. The irrational part of your soul is the part that wants to do all those things, right? Regardless of the cost or consequences. Fukuyama notes that rationality in itself is an insufficient explanation of people's behaviors, right? Because people all the time do things that are irrational. And it's not because they don't know they're irrational, right? It's because they feel compelled to do these things because they see it as a component of their identity, right? They see these irrational behaviors as necessary for personal fulfillment or satisfaction. And so if we look in another text that has to do with some of these topics, we could see Charles Taylor in the Ethics of Authenticity talking about a husband who might leave his wife of a long time and his children to be with a new woman he's met. It's not that he doesn't realize the irrationality of this. It's not that he doesn't realize that it's perceived as wrong, right? What it is that he feels that inherent to this self-fulfillment is being with this other woman. And if that is necessary to live as the self that he wants to live, then this irrational activity can be justified, right? And I think that Plato is an echo of this, is that people aren't solely guided by rationality, and this has bearing for the pursuit of dignity that we pursue as groups and as individuals. Sometimes the cost of demanding public recognition of our individual value or dignity is irrational for what the gain might be, right? Yet that doesn't stop us from feeling compelled to demand public recognition of our dignity. So, two parts of the soul here. But Socrates in the dialogue leads his interlocutors to what Fukuyama calls the third part of the soul. The third part of the soul. And to illustrate this, he gives an example of someone passing a pile of corpses, dead people in the ancient world. And the person passing by the way, if you're interested in where this passage is, it's on page 16 and 17. The person passing by these corpses really doesn't want to look, right? But this other part of him wants to look, right? And you've probably had this happen to you, whether it's when you're passing by an accident or see something particularly shocking or ugly, right? You may want to look away, but there's this other part of you that wants to look. So the rational part doesn't want to go over and inspect the corpses that have been executed. The irrational part wants to go over and see because it's curious. But there's a third part, and this, in the story of this person who's passing by the corpses, the person actually goes over and looks, right? And he says to himself, "Oh, damn you, fine, look at the corpses, you're awful," right? He says this to himself. And this thing that hovers over this boundary and makes the choice is what is the third part. And this third part of the soul is the part that's embarrassed of the irrational choice to go look at the corpses. Why is it embarrassed? Well, because the third part of the soul is the seat of its dignity, which is what Fukuyama and Plato before him call Thymus. And so let's look at a passage here that illustrates the conception of Thymus that he's working from. Let's see. So, we'll read it at length. Fukuyama says, this is on page 17, we could transpose this into a more contemporary example where a drug addict or alcoholic knows that another hit or drink is bad for him or her, but nonetheless takes it, it's the irrational part, and feels a deep self-loathing for being weak. That's the third part, this sense of dignity that hovers over both the rational and the irrational. So he continues, Socrates uses a new word, spirit, to refer to the part of the soul that's the seat of this anger against oneself, which is a poor translation of the Greek word thymos. Socrates then asks Adimantus whether the part of the soul that wanted not to look at the corpses was just another desire, is it just another irrational desire, or was it an aspect of the calculating part, since they both pushed in the same direction. The former view would be the perspective of contemporary economics, where reason is limited only by the calculation of another. Socrates asks, essentially, is there a third part of the soul? And if we skip the quotation that Fukuyama gives there, we pick up with, Adimantus immediately agrees with Socrates that the spirited part, thymos, is neither just another desire, nor an aspect of reason, but is an independent part of the soul. Thymos is both the seat of anger and pride. In other words, thymos, right, he says anger and pride in myself, of my self-worth, right? That's why thymos is upset when I do the thing that I don't want to do. It's because I have pride in myself. And also anger, because when someone behaves towards me in a way that undermines that pride, it's the thymos that is offended by this. Okay. So, let's look at another passage to illuminate this. This is on page 18, just above the middle of the page. He says, Desire and reason are component parts of the human psyche or soul, but a third part, Thymus, acts completely independently of the two. Thymus is the seat of judgments of worth. Leontius believed that he was above staring at corpses, just as a drug addict wants to be a productive employee or a loving mother. Human beings do not just want things that are external to themselves, such as food, drink, Lamborghinis, or that next hit. They also crave positive judgments about their worth or dignity. Those judgments can come from within, as in Leontius's case, but they're most often made by other people in the society around them who recognize their worth. If they receive that positive judgment, they feel pride. If they don't receive it, they feel either anger when they think they're being undervalued, or shame when they realize that they haven't lived up to other people's standards. And this is important here. The third part of the soul, Thymus, is the seat of today's identity politics. And at the conclusion of the last part of this talk, we were talking about identity politics. And so Fukuyama says that in part, this populism that seems to be driving world politics right now is a product of the Thymus, right? Identity politics, the politics of the group and the group's struggle for recognition or value or identity, is a product of the pride and anger that sits in this third part of the soul. But Fukuyama goes on, and this is on page 20 and 21. Fukuyama goes on to say that Plato in the Republic never conceived of Thymus as something that belonged to everyone. The ancient Greek world, Plato said that this doesn't belong to everyone. Not everyone has a right to this sense of Thymus. Rather, Plato attributes it to the warrior class of society. Right? Why the warrior class of society? Because they're the defenders of society and the preservers of the lives of those who are outside of the warrior class. And so those people, the warriors, have a right to claim this Thymus, this dignity. Why? Well, because of their selflessness. Not their selfishness, their selflessness. Their willingness to give up the self is the reason that they are accorded and allowed this sense of Thymus that might see their inherent dignity. That's important. And if you're curious about where he talks about that, it's really on 19, 20, 21. Here's the difference, right? We have a big difference. Is that if in the ancient world, this concept of Thymus was tolerated on the basis of individual selflessness, today everyone makes a claim to Thymus, right? On the basis of their selflessness? No. Precisely on the basis of the self, right? In other words, it's your mere existence that entitles you to being treated with dignity as having value, that entitle you to recognition by the public. That's a big difference. So in other words, the Thymus of our era, in some degree, is self-motivated. We need to recognize your worth simply because you exist. And this is a very democratic idea. The idea that you are inherently valuable just because you're you, right, is a product in some ways of democratic life. And one of the interesting parts of Fukuyama's text, and he doesn't really talk much about this, is that on the one hand, he says that sort of the liberal global consensus is eroding, right? That people are more skeptical than they were about liberal values. And I think that that's probably true, that there is sort of a renewed skepticism of liberty as it's constructed in liberal ideology. But even as sort of people are losing faith in liberalism, this culture of the self and of the value of the self continues to grow unabated. And so the self becomes more and more important. Personal ethos and identity becomes more and more important. And that emphasis on the self or personal identity is itself a product of liberal ideology. And so we have this contradiction that while there seems to be a growing resistance to liberal ideology, at the same time the self, as a component of liberal ideology, seems to continue to escalate this culture of the self. And so that's something maybe to think through. But let's talk a little bit then about democracy, right? Democracy that says that every voice is valuable, right? That everybody is has equal worth to the society. Fukuyama introduces the ancient concept of isothymy, equal worth. Okay. Ideally, this is what democracy advances: isothymy as equal worth. In other words, that one person is worth just as much as another. Each person is equally valuable to the collective, right? That's isothymy. Fukuyama also introduces another term, Megalithymia, right? And Megalithymia is superior worth. And these seem to be, certainly Fukuyama favors isothymy, right? Equal worth, the recognition of the equal value of individuals in the public sphere. The problem for Fukuyama is megalithymia, that at some point this struggle for recognition at the group level can tip over into a quest for power. And he talks about this on page 22. He says, let's start about an inch down on page 22. He says, so an equally powerful human drive is to be seen as just as good as everyone else. Just as good. Something we call isothymy. Megalithymia is what economist Robert Frank labels a positional good. Something that by its very nature cannot be shared because it is based on one's position relative to someone else. Okay, let's pause. Right, and so in other words, right, megalithymia. Not everybody can have megalithymia, right? Because my superior worth requires somebody else's inferior worth, right? And if we take that inferior person and say, well, you're equally worthy, then megalithymia becomes impossible, right? And so, for Fukuyama, megalithymia is the thing to fight, right? Because it requires sort of this suppression or repression of the dignity of others. But let's keep going, right? He says, the rise of modern democracy is the story of the displacement of megalithymia, which he associates with the ancient world, by isothymia. Societies that recognized an elite few were replaced by ones that recognized everyone as inherently equal. This is the displacement of aristocratic society by democratic society. Okay. In Europe, societies stratified by class began to recognize the rights of ordinary people, and nations that had been submerged in great empires sought separate and equal status. The great struggles in American political history over slavery and segregation, workers' rights, women's equality, were ultimately demands that the political system expand the circle of individuals it recognized as having equal rights. Isothymy. Yet, the story is more complicated than that. Contemporary identity politics is driven by the quest for equal recognition by groups that have been marginalized by their societies. But that desire for equal recognition can easily slide over into a demand for recognition of a group's superiority. Now, going off text here, if we return to our example of Trump's movement, right, and we said, well, there are some nationalistic elements here, and I proposed that actually for some people in Trump's base, right, the MAGA, Make America Great Again movement is not coded racism, right, but is a coded rejection of identity politics. Of course, in the process of that rejection, it actually repeats that dynamic and becomes itself a kind of identity politics, right? But I think that this dynamic is precisely what drives that version of identitarian politics on the right. It's that what Fukuyama just described there, that some people who say they want equal worth are perceived as wanting to be recognized as superior. And so I think that this is kind of the culture of victimhood that gets perpetuated on the left, where sort of your value to society or even your individual moral virtue is determined by, well, first off, how different are you from the norm or from the mainstream or from the majority? And second off, how much have those differences been marked by oppression or victimization, right? And if the answer is to a large degree, then automatically, in the more crude versions of left politics, then this accords you superior worth because these differences that constitute your identity have been suppressed or repressed or oppressed by history or by society. And so I think that at least sort of the identitarian right wing, what they're seeing is that this search that for isothynia in historically marginalized groups, equal worth, actually seems to tip over into demand at a certain point for superior recognition. Now, I'm not making any claim about whether or not that's true, right? But I'm saying that I think that that's what's perceived by certain elements on the identitarian right. Okay. So, this is the problem, right, for Fukuyama. Actually, both of these are problems, and here's why, right? Both isothynia and megalithymia are problems, right? Megalithymia, we already talked about why it's a problem. It's a problem because it requires an other to be marginalized, right? If we're going to elevate this person, we can't do that without saying, what is this person elevated in relation to? And what they're elevated in relation to is this other person, right? So megalithymia demands a kind of at least soft repression, if not, outright, human catastrophes like Jim Crow or the Holocaust or these kind of things. So that's the problem with megalithymia, which is fairly obvious. The problem with isothynia is perhaps less recognized. And the problem with isothynia is that not everybody is equally valuable. All right? Different people have different capacities. Right? Anytime you've been a member of a team, or if you're a sports fan, you can recognize that there are certain players on the team who matter more than others. Right? That's not to say that the others are not valuable. Right? It's to say that there are some who play a more critical role than others. Right? If you're a sports fan, you've probably watched, like, when the best player on the team goes down and seems to be injured, you're like, oh no, anybody but so-and-so, right? That's because you're not operating off an assumption of isothynia. In part because you know that nobody else on the team is as good as LeBron, or is as good as James Harden, right? Or is as good as Bregman, right? Or whoever. You recognize that it is not equal worth. And the problem with an ideology of equal worth is that it denies recognition of those who contribute things of greater value to the collective. And so this selflessness is sort of discouraged under a matrix of isothynia. And so this is kind of the catch-22 that we find ourselves in the modern era, is if this is the choice that sort of Enlightenment liberalism extends to us. And, this is the defect, right? Are either of these wholly desirable? One's more desirable than the other, but both present us with problems. And I think that this sort of is the root of some of that contemporary skepticism about sort of liberal Enlightenment assumptions about democracy and individuality and personal satisfaction. Now, one more thing, right, is Fukuyama goes on to make this distinction between the inner self and the outer self. And we might ask, well, which one in our society is privileged, the inner self or the outer self? And I think most thinkers agree, right, that at least in theory, not in practice, the inner self is privileged. In other words, how you feel about yourself inside is perceived as what's true about you. That what other people perceive, right? That's just sort of judging a book by its cover, right? You know yourself best, and how you get in touch with yourself is a kind of searching, right? A quest for the self. And this quest for the self is simultaneously a quest for the public recognition of dignity. Okay? And the interesting thing about this is, to many of us, it doesn't seem strange, this quest for the self, this finding yourself, this searching. But it's actually really new, right? And it's an extension of democratic ideology, and it's also a product of Protestant Reformation, Enlightenment science, and if you're curious about the ways in which those are connected, I might point you to Guignon's book on being authentic. So those are important ways that this privileging of the inner self emerged. And yet, there's this perception that self-fulfillment depends on the discovery of this inner self. And in some ways, that emphasis on the self at the cost of society, right? If what you discover in yourself, if what you find to be your true self is at odds with social convention, then most modern people say, well, then convention be damned, because I gotta be me, right? You do you. We hear that a lot. You do you. You just don't worry about what other people expect of you. You just be you, right? And in some ways, that elevation of selfishness, concern with the self, is at odds with the selflessness that animated the polis, the ideal society that Plato or Socrates described, right? And indeed, right, like that undergirds much of the thinking that animates Western democracy and political life. Polis, of course, means it refers to the collective, and by extension, politics refer to the collective. And so identity politics, which emphasize the individualistic aspect, right, of the group that is asking for recognition, it seems to me is at odds. Like, identity politics is a contradiction in terms. It's an oxymoron, right? To pursue identity is to separate the self, right, from the polis, right? To take on a identity that is not defined by the norm. And so we can see not only that liberal Western ideology affords us two options that are less than desirable, but the whole notion of the self, whether megalothymic or isothymic, right, in some ways is at odds with the political project writ large. Now, why are we talking about this in a rhetoric class? Well, partly because one of the fascinating things is how quickly people's perception that the outer self was what mattered became displaced with the inner self. Remember, the fact that your inner voice that tells you that you need to be a singer, right, like, is respected, or that you heed it, that's a new idea, an idea that people had to become convinced of. Because in the past, other people looked at you, your outer self, and told you what you were. You're Jim's son, you're a pig farmer, right? And it wasn't that inside that person 700 years ago was thinking, no, I'm not a pig farmer, I'm a singer. They were just like, yeah, I am a pig farmer. Whether or not I like it, that's another question, but I'm a pig farmer. I think in the modern world, it's only there that the person says, no, I'm not a pig farmer, I'm getting ready to go to voice school next year. I'm a singer, right? And that idea, that response, is one that's been rhetorically conditioned and that happened, to become the norm virtually overnight in historical terms, really just since the Enlightenment. And that in itself is a shocking rhetorical achievement. It was through argument and debate and speech and the interaction of ideas that the inner self became to take on this hallowed status. Secondly, the second reason that we're talking about this as relates to rhetoric is we've been talking on an individual level about ethos and identity. And on the individual level alone, it may seem, well, the identity game, the authenticity game, is a positive game to play. But I think what Fukuyama does is a great job of showing what happens on a collective political level when we bring these assumptions about the self that are embedded in liberal democracy to scale on a collective level, right? And when we do that, when we bring it to scale on a collective level, right, we see that some problems emerge that might not have been visible when we were just considering the fixation with the self and authenticity on the level of the individual. Okay, so Fukuyama brings to scale for us some of these more modern contemporary ideas about identity and rhetoric and the self, and shows what they look like when we try to enact them in the social sphere as a society at large. So, always happy to answer questions, always happy to talk Buffalo Sabres, whatever you want to talk about, hit me up in the comments. I'm going to go grade some midterms, and then I'm going to get back to searching for my authentic self. Have a good day.